In the quiet of the night, under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, a man walks alone. His pace is steady, his grip firm on the cane. Behind him the sound of laughter echoes, mocking, closing in. They think they've found someone weak, someone easy. They don't know that they've crossed paths with someone who has endured more than they could ever imagine. A man whose life was forged in trials most would not survive. A man who once stood where fear held no power, where skill and precision meant life or death. But strength is not always loud. Power does not always announce itself. And tonight those following him are about to learn a lesson they'll never forget. Who is this man? What lies beneath his calm exterior? And why will this encounter change everything? The answer is coming, and it's not what anyone expects. Before we jump into this powerful story, let me ask you, what would you do if you were underestimated because of how the world sees you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below and where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you're ready for stories that inspire, challenge, and keep you thinking long after the video ends, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out. In the heart of a modest neighborhood, Daniel Marshall lives a life marked by routine and quiet resilience. His days begin with a rhythm that many might overlook. A man moving through life with determination, one step at a time, aided by a cane that has become both a necessity and a symbol of his endurance. To the world, Daniel is simply a disabled man, navigating a society that often sees only limitations. Neighbors know him for his kindness. He's the man who carries groceries for the elderly woman 2 doors down, the one who fixes bicycles for children in the area. He is soft-spoken, approachable, and unassuming. For the kids, he's the gentle giant. For the adults, he's the quiet soul who keeps to himself. But there are things about Daniel Marshall that they don't know, things he prefers to keep locked away. In his small apartment, there are glimpses of a different life, a folded military flag on a shelf, a tarnished set of dog tags, and faded photographs of men in uniform. News clipping lies tucked between the pages of an old book, its headline nearly illegible with age. Elite operative saves hostages in daring rescue. Beneath the surface of his calm existence lies a history shaped by choices no one around him could imagine. Choices that have left both scars and lessons. But Daniel didn't come here to be remembered for the past. He came to start over, to find peace in a world that often offers none. For years he has worked to live unnoticed, blending into the background of a community where his presence feels both accepted and unseen. Yet even the quietest lives are not immune to the shadows that seek them out. It began with Whispers. A gang known for their boldness had recently begun to spread their influence in the area. Their presence was unmistakable. Graffiti on walls, loud music from cars parked too long, and eyes that lingered too long on anyone who seemed out of place. They called themselves the Iron Fangs, a name meant to inspire fear, and their reputation lived up to it. Petty thefts, intimidation, and harassment were their calling cards. But their boldness had been growing. They sought out those who seemed easy to overpower, using their strength in numbers to get what they wanted. For weeks, Daniel had crossed paths with them only briefly. Averted gazes and ignored provocations had kept him out of their focus. But in groups like theirs, silence is often seen as weakness, and weakness is something they could not resist exploiting. The leader of the Iron Fangs, a man named Jared Cross, was the kind of figure people whispered about, but rarely confronted. His charm masked a ruthless nature, and his word was law among his followers. Jared thrived on control, and for him, Daniel was an enigma, a man who walked with the burden of a disability, but carried himself with quiet confidence. It was the kind of confidence Jared wanted to break. It wasn't long before Daniel became their target, though not by his own doing. A chance encounter, a word spoken out of turn, or perhaps merely the wrong place at the wrong time. No one would ever know for sure what sparked their attention. But what was clear was that they saw him as an easy mark, someone they could corner, intimidate, and humiliate to reaffirm their dominance. Yet Daniel's silence wasn't born of fear. It was a choice, one he had made long ago when he turned away from a life where conflict was routine and violence was second nature. For years he had trained himself to step back, to stay in control, and to let others underestimate him. But there are moments in life when silence is no longer an option, when a line is crossed, and a man must decide whether to reveal the truths he has kept hidden. The Iron Fangs didn't know who Daniel Marshall was. They didn't know the discipline behind his every movement, the instincts sharpened by years of training, or the strength that lay dormant beneath his unassuming demeanor. They only saw what they wanted to see, a man with a cane and a quiet life, and that mistake would cost them. As the days passed, their provocations grew bolder, the gang's taunts became louder, their presence more oppressive. But Daniel remained the same, steady and calm, giving them no reaction to feed their need for dominance. It wasn't defiance, it was restraint, born from a wisdom they could never understand. Yet even the strongest walls can only withstand so much pressure. What happens when a man who has fought the worst battles of his life is forced to confront another? What unfolds when those who believe they hold all the power push too far? For Daniel, this was no longer a question. It was a reality he could no longer avoid. It began on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day where the routines of life carry on without interruption. Daniel Marshall stood in the corner of a small store, selecting a few items from a shelf. The sound of casual conversation and distant laughter filled the air, a community momentarily at peace. But peace is fragile, and for some it is nothing more than an opportunity to disrupt. They entered as a group, their presence loud and intentional. The Iron Fangs, led by Jared Cross, made no effort to blend in. Their laughter was sharp, their voices carrying a tone that demanded attention. Daniel remained focused on his task, avoiding eye contact, hoping that his silence would be enough to deter them. It wasn't. The first words came as a taunt, a sharp, mocking comment about the way he walked, followed by a slur that turned heads in the store. Daniel didn't react. He reached for his items and moved toward the counter, his expression calm, his pace deliberate. The gang, however, wasn't satisfied with being ignored. They wanted a response. One of them, a younger member eager to prove himself, stepped directly into Daniel's path. The tension was immediate, the air growing heavier with unspoken challenge. Daniel stopped, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Excuse me," he said simply, his voice quiet but firm. The gang laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that filled the space. The young man didn't move, leaning closer as though testing how far he could push. But Daniel didn't flinch. He simply stepped aside and continued to the counter, paying for his items and walking out without looking back. For most, the encounter might have ended there. But for Jared Cross and his gang, it was a challenge to their authority, a slight they couldn't ignore. They followed him outside, their footsteps quickening as they closed the distance. Words flew after him, taunts and threats growing louder with each step. Yet Daniel walked on, his composure unbroken, his focus unwavering. To the gang, his calm was infuriating, a refusal to give them the reaction they craved. The tension escalated with every block. By the time Daniel reached the quieter streets near his apartment, the gang's mockery had turned into something more deliberate. One of them picked up a rock, tossing it ahead of him so it clattered across the pavement. Another shouted, "Where do you think you're going? We're just getting started." Still, Daniel remained silent, his pace unchanging. What they couldn't see, what they couldn't understand, was that Daniel Marshall wasn't ignoring them out of fear. He wasn't walking away because he was weak or unwilling to stand his ground. He was measuring the situation, calculating the variables, and weighing the consequences. Years of training had taught him to think before acting, to assess before engaging. This was no different. As the group closed in, Daniel's mind drifted briefly to memories long buried. Flashes of a life he had left behind. The rigid discipline of training camps, the hum of helicopters overhead, the weight of missions that demanded precision and clarity. His hands, now carrying a simple grocery bag, had once carried tools of survival, tools of destruction. And even now, in the face of this unprovoked aggression, that part of him remained sharp, waiting just beneath the surface. He recalled the lessons drilled into him. Never react without purpose, never escalate unless necessary, and always maintain control. These principles had kept him alive through situations far more dangerous than the one unfolding now. But as the gang's insults turned into threats, as their steps grew closer and their laughter more pointed, Daniel understood that control was slipping from them. And when control is lost, chaos is inevitable. They didn't know who they were dealing with. To them, Daniel was just another target, another man they could intimidate and humiliate to affirm their dominance. They couldn't see the years of discipline in his steady gait, the years of resilience in his unshaken demeanor, and they certainly couldn't see the quiet warning in his calm, measured breaths. As they moved closer, their words became sharper, their intent clearer. One of them, emboldened by the others, reached out to grab the strap of Daniel's bag. The movement was quick, almost impulsive, but it was enough. In that moment, something shifted. A line had been crossed. Daniel stopped walking. He stood still, his back to the gang, his head slightly tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. The gang laughed again, mistaking his stillness for hesitation. But what they didn't realize was that this wasn't hesitation. It was preparation. Daniel Marshall wasn't just standing there. He was deciding what came next. And what came next would be unlike anything they had ever experienced. This story is heating up, and we want to hear from you. How do you think you would react if you were in Daniel's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion matters, and we're reading every one of them. And if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. It helps us bring more stories like this to you. Plus, subscribing ensures you're always in the loop. So go ahead, click that subscribe button and the notification bell. The streetlights had begun to thin as Daniel reached a stretch of the neighborhood where the noise of the city faded into an uneasy quiet. It was the kind of place where shadows stretched long, where the sounds of footsteps seemed louder, sharper. He stopped walking and turned slightly, his cane tapping against the pavement as if marking the silence. They surrounded him in moments, their footsteps deliberate, their positions carefully chosen to block every possible route of escape. Jared Cross stepped forward. A smug grin spread across his face. He looked Daniel up and down, gesturing with a wave of his hand to his crew. "Look at this guy. Doesn't even flinch. Do you think you're better than us, huh?" His voice carried a tone of mockery, tinged with the arrogance of someone who had never faced real resistance. Daniel's eyes didn't move. He didn't respond to the taunts, the laughter, or the casual jabs made at his expense. Instead, he took a slow, measured breath, his gaze sweeping the area, not out of fear but calculation. The broken bottles scattered near a dumpster, the uneven pavement, even the streetlight casting faint shadows behind the gang. Every detail entered his mind, like pieces of a puzzle being assembled in real time. Jared, irritated by Daniel's lack of reaction, stepped closer, his tone hardening. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too scared to speak?" His crew laughed, their confidence growing with every passing second of Daniel's silence. Then it happened. A single motion, a hand reaching for Daniel's shoulder. The moment the contact was made, everything changed. What followed wasn't an escalation. It was precision. Daniel moved quickly, his cane shifting in his hand as he twisted his body, breaking the grip and forcing the man off balance. The gang member stumbled backward, his expression shifting from confidence to shock in an instant. The air grew tense, their laughter fading as the gang realized something was different. Jared's smile faltered, but he masked it with bravado, barking orders. "Get him!" he shouted. Two of the men lunged forward, their movements clumsy and overconfident. Daniel's response was swift and efficient. He sidestepped the first, using his momentum against him with a sharp turn that sent the man crashing into the wall. The second man was met with a sharp jab of the cane to his ribs, followed by a calculated sweep to his legs, sending him to the ground. Years of discipline were evident in every move Daniel made. There was no hesitation, no wasted effort. Each strike, each step was deliberate, designed to neutralize the threat without excess. It wasn't anger driving him. There was no malice in his actions. It was survival, a skill honed through countless missions in places far more dangerous than this alley. Jared stood frozen for a moment, watching as his men struggled to recover. The confidence that had radiated from him minutes ago was replaced by uncertainty. He shouted again, ordering the rest of the gang to move in, but Daniel was already ahead of them. A discarded trash can lid became a makeshift shield, deflecting a swing from a broken bottle. A swift elbow to the jaw disarmed another attacker, his weapon clattering to the ground. As the fight continued, the gang's numbers began to work against them. Their movements became erratic and uncoordinated, while Daniel's precision never wavered. A strike to the knee incapacitated one. A calculated shove sent another sprawling. The narrow alley became a stage for Daniel's mastery, the chaos of the gang contrasting sharply with his calm, methodical movements. Jared, now alone and visibly shaken, backed away, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. "Hey, man, we didn't mean anything by it," he stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. Daniel stood still, his breathing steady, his cane lightly tapping against the ground. He didn't speak, his silence more powerful than any words he could have said. Jared took another step back before turning and running, leaving his crew behind. For a moment the alley was silent again, the faint sound of the distant city returning as the adrenaline faded. Daniel stood there, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He looked down at his cane, then at the scattered remnants of the confrontation, the broken bottle, the discarded weapons, the groaning figures of the gang. He turned and walked away, leaving the scene as quietly as he had entered it. To the gang, this was an encounter they would never forget, a lesson taught by a man they had gravely underestimated. But to Daniel, it was just another test of restraint, another reminder of the past he had tried so hard to leave behind. The alley was quiet now, the chaos replaced by an uneasy stillness. The gang members, scattered and groaning on the ground, struggled to process what had just happened. Daniel Marshall stood at the edge of the scene, his cane resting lightly on the pavement. His movements were calm and deliberate, his breathing steady. He paused for a moment, scanning the alley one last time, then turned and walked away, his steps unhurried, leaving behind no words, no gloating, only silence. As he emerged from the shadows of the alley, the faint sound of footsteps caught his attention. A man, middle-aged and wide-eyed, stood at a distance, clutching a bag of groceries. He had seen everything. His face was a mix of shock and admiration, as though he was struggling to reconcile what he had just witnessed. He stepped closer, his voice hesitant, breaking the stillness. I don't even know what to say. How did you do that?" Daniel stopped and regarded the man briefly, his expression unreadable. After a moment he spoke, his voice low but firm. "Sometimes, peace is the best weapon," he said, his tone carrying the weight of experience. "But sometimes you have to remind people not to underestimate you." With that, he nodded slightly and continued walking, leaving the man standing there, his thoughts racing. Later that evening, Daniel sat alone in his small apartment. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city outside. The groceries he had carried home sat on the counter, untouched. He leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the folded flag resting on a nearby shelf. The fight was over, but the memories it had stirred were not so easily silenced. As he sat there, the events of the day played back in his mind. He thought about the gang, their aggression, their arrogance. He thought about the choice he had made to fight, to defend himself, and how easily it could have gone another way. He didn't regret his actions. He knew they had been necessary. But he also knew that every time he was forced to confront violence, it pulled him back into a world he had worked so hard to leave behind. Daniel's gaze shifted to the window, where the faint glow of the streetlights illuminated the quiet street below. He thought about the neighborhood, the people he had come to know, the life he had built for himself here. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was his, and for all its flaws, it was a place where he had found a semblance of peace. As the hours passed, Daniel's thoughts turned to the future. He wondered if the gang would return, if the lesson they had learned tonight would be enough to keep them away. He hoped it would, not for his sake, but for theirs. because Daniel Marshall was not a man who sought out violence, but he was a man who understood that sometimes it found you, and when it did, you had to be ready. In the stillness of his apartment, surrounded by the echoes of his past and the faint promises of tomorrow, Daniel made a quiet vow to continue walking the path he had chosen, no matter how difficult it might be, to live with strength, with resilience, and with the understanding that peace, though fragile, was always worth protecting. And if ever that peace was threatened, he would be there to remind the world of the strength it had chosen to overlook. What's your takeaway from Daniel Marshall's story? How would you handle a situation like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's start a conversation. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you never miss our next gripping story. Your support helps us bring these powerful narratives to life. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.